Anybody want to go fly a kite? You might just take off into orbit. When I was little, I remember being afraid to go to bed at night. And I can remember every few seconds I would open my eyes to see if the boogeyman was coming out from under my bed. But somewhere along the line, I convinced myself that if I could pull the covers all the way up to my neck and lie real still and convince the boogeyman that I was dead, that he would leave me alone. Now, obviously, I realize now that that fear was unfounded, especially since I have Beverly to protect me at night. But you know what? In many ways, I've simply traded the fear of the boogeyman for equally unfounded fears. I've traded fear of the boogeyman for the fear of what if. What if I were to lose my job? What if Beverly or I get sick? What if, God forbid, I lose one of my boys or one of my grandkids? And that list of fears of what if just could continue to fill up a page. Now, in my better moments, I remind myself that I'm a child of Almighty God, who is creator and sustainer of the universe. And He's watching over me and He's with me. And in those moments, my fear of what if is replaced by a solid confidence in God. But there's other moments when my confidence in the Lord leaks out. And it's replaced once again by fear. Be honest with me. How many of you know the struggle? How do we keep our level of confidence in the Lord full so that there is no room for fear? How can we stop these leaks in our lives? And I believe the solution is that we remember that God is faithful to deliver His people of whatever enslaves us, to deliver His people of whatever endangers us. And that is the theme of the book of Exodus. And we're beginning a series today on the book of Exodus, which I would sum up with the word deliverance. I'm titling the series Special Delivery. The Jews actually titled this book differently than we do. The Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Jews, in their Hebrew language, they entitled the books by the first few words of the book. For instance, to the Hebrews, Genesis was in the beginning. That was the name of that book. It was when the Bible was translated from Hebrew into Greek, the Old Testament was translated from Hebrew into Greek, it's known as the Septuagint, that these names were given to these books. And so Exodus went from being under the Jews, it was entitled, These Are the Names. But the Septuagint gave it the title of Exodus. Exodus means the way out. Exodus means deliverance. The way out of what? The deliverance from what? Now, the obvious answer we want to give is deliverance out of Egyptian bondage. But do you realize that's about 1/3 of the story of Exodus? And so this morning I want to show you some examples of how this deliverance, how this way out theme works through the book of Exodus, which is simply us previewing the contents of our package. Exodus contains story after story of God's faithfulness in a series of special deliveries that temporarily move his people to a level of confidence. But that confidence quickly springs a leak and leaks out into the sands of the Sinai. For example, Exodus chapters 1 to 13 find the Israelites enslaved in a land where they are working under harsh taskmasters. Chapter 1, verse 14 says they made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. And this oppression went on for 400 years. But God had not forgotten his people, nor had God forgotten the promises that he had made to Abraham. Look with me at Genesis chapter 15. And as you turn there, I would just want to remind you that these words to Abraham are roughly 400 years before the actual events that we're going to see in Exodus chapter 1. And in Genesis chapter 15 and verse 12, as God cuts a covenant with Abraham, this is what happens. As the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, "Know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated there. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation, your descendants will come back here." At this time, Abram is in the promised land. In 400 years, your descendants will come back here. And so God chose a man. His name is Moses. And he chose Moses to be the deliverer of his people. He came to Moses in the wilderness when he was tending his father-in-law's sheep, Jethro, not to be confused with Jethro Bodine of the Beverly Hillbillies. Some of you don't know what I'm talking about. I used to love that show, and I'm sorry, I just admit it. That probably makes me a real geek or something, but... And he told Moses the most amazing thing. Exodus chapter 3 and verse 7. The Lord said, "I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I'm concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hands of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Havites, and Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I've seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go, I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." I want you to notice that God has been witnessing his people's misery. And God has heard their crying. And God was concerned about their suffering. And he promises not only to deliver them out of bondage in Egypt, but he also promises to deliver them to the promised land under the leadership of the deliverer, Moses. Don't miss his promise. God promises people that he's going to bring them to a beautiful, fertile land, a land flowing with milk and honey. The Israelites have nothing to fear. Because no matter what happens to them along the way, it could not hinder God's ability to fulfill His promises. And so after the great drama of the 10 plagues that we see in the early chapters of Exodus, the Egyptians relented and they allowed the Israelites to leave. And not only that, they also provide them with huge amounts of gold and silver and clothing. We read in Exodus 12 verses 35 and 36, just as God had promised Abraham back in Genesis 15. And so they left Egypt. Israel's confidence level in God is at a high. It's full. It's running over. And they're excited about their future. And that overflowing confidence lasts until the first test of their faith, the Red Sea. Now, when we read the account of the Red Sea and when we read other accounts of Israel in the book of Exodus, it makes us want to ask, what happened to their confidence in God? It leaked out. And it's replaced by fear. Fear fills that void of confidence in God. But that doesn't stop God from delivering them yet again. They walked across the Red Sea on dry ground. They turn around and look as the armies that are pursuing them come into the Red Sea and are covered up by God and drowned. And once again they rejoice in God, their deliverer, and they sing songs of praise to Him as they're once again filled with confidence in Him. And it lasts for 3 whole days, 72 hours, until their confidence leaks out again. They become thirsty at Marah. Now, when they become thirsty at Marah, do they view this as another opportunity for God to deliver them? No. Did they wait in anticipation to see what God was going to do? No. No, Exodus 15 and verse 34 or 24 says the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What are we to drink?" And Moses cried out to the Lord, and the Lord said, "Take a piece of wood and throw it into the bitter water." And when Moses does that, he throws it into the bitter water, and that bitter water becomes sweet. And as the people's stomachs are filled with that sweet water, their hearts are filled with confidence to overflowing in God. This time the confidence in God really takes hold, because it lasts for a whole month and a half. And then they become hungry. And they begin to grumble to Moses and to Aaron, his brother. Chapter 16 and verse 3, they say, "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you've brought us out here into the desert to starve this entire assembly to death." Can you believe that? And yet once again, despite their faithlessness, God was faithful, and He delivered them from their hunger by providing them with quail and manna. And the whole cycle starts over again. They're filled with confidence until chapter 17 and verses 1 and 2, when they come to Rephidim. They're thirsty again. You would think after what's happened at Marah, they would know God's going to take care of them, but no, they're thirsty again, and they begin to complain. This is the pattern we see in the book of Exodus. God demonstrates His faithfulness to deliver His people. His people respond with a spurt of confidence, but their faith quickly leaks out, and every time it leaks out, it is replaced by fear. So what's the point? Was Exodus written to illustrate the fear and the faithlessness of the Israelites? I think there's a greater lesson for us. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 10 with me, and beginning in verse 1. I'm sorry, I want to read from verse 11. 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 11. These things happened to them, and Paul's talking about to Israel. These things happened to them as examples and were written down as warnings for us, on whom the culmination of the ages has come. So, if you think you are standing firm, he's not talking to the Israelites of the past here, he's talking to you and me. If you think you're standing firm, be careful that you don't fall. No temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you're tempted, He will also provide a way out so that you can endure it. And so what are we to learn from Israel's example? I don't think that Exodus was written so that you and me, 3,500 years later, can sit back smugly and self-righteously and say, look at those ungrateful people. God was faithful to them. He acted. They would respond with gratitude, and then it would leak out, and they would begin to fear. And look, we're just so much spiritually superior to them. Might I suggest to you, we've never known hunger and thirst like they probably did in the wilderness. And yet you and I move through the same cycles in our own lives. Confidence in God. Something happens in our lives to disturb it. The confidence leaks out, which leads to fear. This is not for us to look at and feel smug. This is for us to look at and recognize we're in this story too. Listen, life is a constant test of our faith in the Lord. And as a child of God, every trying situation that I face begs this question from God. Will you trust me? Will you trust me to deliver you from your financial crisis? Will you trust me to deliver you from your physical illness? Would you trust me to deliver you from your anxiety about the future? Would you trust me to deliver you as you go through your grief journey? Will you trust me to deliver you from your anxiety about your future? And he says, if I choose not to deliver you in the way that you think I should deliver you, will you trust me to provide you with the strength to endure? As he said to Paul in 2 Corinthians 12:9, my strength is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. One of the great lessons from Exodus is for us to look at our fears within the context of a God who loves us. Because God says to us, I'm the mighty God. I'm the God of the impossible. I'm the God who hears your cries from heaven. I'm the God who cares about your sufferings. I'm the God who parts the sea. I'm the God who quenches thirst. I'm the God who feeds the hungry. I'm the God who gives strength to the weak. I am the Lord who provides. I keep my promises, and I'll deliver you safely to your final destination. So stop living in fear. Stop being afraid, because I'm always with you. Does Exodus have your attention yet? Because as we study this book, we're going to find a statement that's repeated in about a dozen places in chapters 6 to 14. Not always repeated exactly the same way, but basically this is what it's going to say. And by the way, the Bible's like the way we teach in life. You teach by repetition. That's often one of the best ways to teach. And so we see this repeated over and over again, and here is the statement we're going to see. Then you will know that I am. Then you will know that I am Yahweh. You see, physical bondage was not Israel's greatest problem. Israel's greatest problem was spiritual darkness. Israel's greatest problem was they didn't know God. And that problem burns the heart of God as He looks upon a world that's full of suffering and pain and oppression. And God wants to deliver His people from spiritual darkness. God wants them to know Him. God wants them to need Him. Do you ever listen to our prayers? And I'm not saying this to be critical. I think it's human nature. But our prayers often sound like this. Lord, would you please deliver so-and-so from their illness? Lord, would you please deliver them from their addiction? Lord, would you please deliver them from their financial troubles? And what are we really saying in those prayers? I'm afraid what we're really saying is, Lord, if you would just save us from our circumstances, then everything will be all right. Would it? Not necessarily. And that's the kind of prayer that the Hebrew people were praying. Oh God, our big problem is that we are slaves in Egypt, and if you would just get us out of Egypt, we can take care of it from there. Just deliver us from them, Lord. That's all we're asking. But God says, you're asking too little. Because physical suffering isn't the biggest problem. Your real problem is that you don't know me. You don't know who I am. And you don't know what I'm wanting to do with you in this life. And so we too easily pray, Lord, deliver me from my trouble. When God might say back to us, don't you understand that it is in this trouble that you're now living in that you can come to know me better? Listen, this is really important that I establish this, and I think most of you know I feel this way already. But I do not want you to hear me suggesting that God sends us troubles to teach us lessons. I'm not saying He can't do that. But I can't picture God in my wildest imagination. I cannot picture Him 4 years ago when we were bombarding heaven with prayers to deliver our daughter. I can't picture Him turning to Gabriel or whomever and saying, well, why don't we just go ahead and take Rick and Beverly's daughter, because maybe Rick will learn more about how to trust me through that. That is not the God I worship. But I do believe this, and it's come to, I've had to travel to come to this. I do believe that nothing happens to us without God's knowledge. And I do believe that nothing happens to us, Job chapter 1, nothing happens to us without God's permission. And that means that nothing happens to us that cannot be redeemed by God. And that means that nothing happens to us that cannot bring blessing to us or others. I don't know why certain misfortunes come on us. Well, I guess I do know. I think it's because we live in a fallen world. But I do know that God can use those things to bless me or to bless somebody else or to bring Him glory. And that's what happened to Israel. Did God send Israel into Egyptian captivity? No. Genesis chapter 50 and verse 20 says He sent them to Egypt because of the famine. Then why are they in captivity? Did God cause that to happen? No. There was a tyrannical Pharaoh, we're told in Exodus chapter 1 and verses 8 to 10, who placed them into bondage. And yet, through that, God is able to accomplish a greater good. And through that, Israel is able to learn some things about God that they might not have learned in any other way. So what did God reveal to Israel that enlightened their spiritual darkness? Well, in chapters 1 to 15, we're shown a stunning revelation of God's power. Over and over again, we see the power of God worked in Egypt. He says in those, then you will know that I am Yahweh. But after escaping Pharaoh's army, Israel then begins to wonder, what is this God like? And so he says, let me show you. And in chapters 16 to 24, we find the second main part of the book of Exodus. In those chapters, we have a twofold revelation of the character and nature of God. In chapters 16 to 18, God reveals His providence, and He does that by taking care of them in the wilderness. Amazing. Their sandals never wore out. Their clothes never wear out. God is taking care of them. Again and again, He demonstrates that He will take care of their basic needs because He is a compassionate God. And then in chapters 19 to 24, He reveals that He's a God of principles. Through the covenant at Mount Sinai, through the giving of the 10 Commandments, God invites Israel to learn about His character and to learn about His nature by living out His principles. It's as if God is saying, now that you know what I'm like, live my life, value what I value. And so when we come to the end of Exodus chapter 24, God has delivered His people in two big ways already. He has delivered them from physical bondage, and at least in principle, He has delivered them from spiritual darkness. But there's still 16 chapters of Exodus left. Was there still a problem from which the children of Israel needed to be delivered? And to answer that, I want you to consider what the remaining chapters are like. And unfortunately, me included, we come to these chapters and we get bored. But I think it's because we don't consider the overarching beauty of what's being shared there. It's about the tabernacle. And in chapters 25 to 31, there are detailed instructions given about how to build that tabernacle, how to furnish it, and even how the priests are to dress when they minister there. And then in chapters 35 to 40, almost verbatim, we have a repetition of what we have just been told in the preceding chapters. The pronouns basically change from it being God saying, you shall make, to it saying, so He made. Why are we told the same story twice? Well, as I said, that begins in chapter 25. If you want to look at the end of chapter 24 and see where it ends there before we enter into the description of the tabernacle. At the end of chapter 24, Moses is on Mount Sinai. Moses is the only person at that point who can be in the presence of God. By the time we get to the end of the description of the tabernacle, the end of chapter 40, God is present in the tabernacle in the middle of the people. The tabernacle is about the presence of God. The tabernacle is about God coming home to His people. And so here the greatest problem of all is really addressed. Because do we need deliverance from the suffering and the sin of this world? Yes. Do we need deliverance from our ignorance of the nature and the character of God? Yes. But I would suggest to you that the third problem answers both of those first two. Do we need deliverance from our alienation from God, which is at the heart of those other two things? Yes, yes, yes. Exodus occurred not just to get Israel out of Egypt and out of its bondage. The purpose of Exodus is really much greater than that. Exodus is about God coming home to His people. I imagine this conversation that took place. I imagine Satan saying to God, "Admit it, God, I've beaten you. Because you made them for love and you made them for fellowship, and because they have disobeyed you in sin, you can never have that with them ever again. I win." And God says, "Satan, this isn't over. In fact, this story's just begun." And the rest of the Bible is about God's coming home to a human heart, taking up residence within us. I'm afraid sometimes we think that we just need God for what He can give us. But without God's presence, all of that's worthless. And I have struggled. I used to love Genesis chapter 22, the story of Abraham offering Isaac, and I have so struggled with that story. But I've come to realize something that happens there that has great meaning to me now. Because basically in that story, Abraham is saying, if I have to choose between God and God's gift, just give me God. And so at the end of Exodus, we hear God saying, "I want to live in your midst. I want to be with you." And now this side of it, we know that the tabernacle was just the beginning of that story, not the end. He didn't intend to just live among His people, where there was still separation from them. He intended to live in His people. He intended to live through His people, made available at the cross and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. But the final chapters of Exodus begin to point the way to the achievement of that ultimate goal. So I want to close with a passage from Ephesians chapter 3 and verse 14, where Paul writes, "For this reason, I kneel before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth derives its name. I pray that out of His glorious riches He may strengthen you with power through His Spirit in your inner being, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith. And I pray that you, being rooted and established in love, may have power together with all the Lord's holy people to grasp how wide and long and high and deep is the love of Christ, and to know this love that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled to the measure of all the fullness of God." That's the story that begins in Exodus. And when we look at the tabernacle, in all its beauty, with its gold and its silver and its reds and its blues and its purples, along with the sweet smell of the incense, what we do is catch a glimpse of how our hearts ought to look when God is living in them. It's a deliverance from separation, and it's a deliverance from loneliness. And it is a deliverance from fear. And it is a deliverance into the Holy of Holies. And a deliverance into the very presence of God. So this morning, as we stand to sing, if you need to respond in any way to the invitation of Jesus Christ to become a child of His through baptism, or to have prayers over you, we encourage you to do that. Maybe you want to go to room 102 just to visit with an elder and his wife. Make that decision today if it applies to you as we stand now together and sing.